On this episode of the Photography News podcast, Roger makes a confession, Will talks to mushrooms, and Kingsley dices with death. Again. Hello and welcome to the latest Photography News podcast. My name is Roger Payne and I'm the editorial director at Photography News. And I'm joined as usual by my two cohorts, both of whom maybe got haircuts before the lockdown started. So I am joined by Mr. Photography and the editor of Photography News, Will Chung. Lovely haircut, Will. Nice to meet you.
Very much so. How are we doing, fellas? Are we well?
Very good. Thanks very much. And along with Will, less haircut done, but wearing a lovely, what looks like is that the Singleton tartan shirt? Contributing editor Kingsley Singleton. Hi, Kingsley.
Hi, how are you doing? This shirt is very warm, and that's what's required at the moment. No, I haven't had a haircut, but I did go to bed with wet hair, and so perhaps that's the flock of seagulls look that I'm rocking might be answerable to that.
And what about the design of that shirt?
I wish there was a Singleton tartan. No, what I'm doing is I'm channeling 1970s Berlin David Bowie with this shirt.
And you're doing it very well.
As if you didn't know.
Well, nice to have you both here. This is the 13th episode. We're recording just after Halloween, and it is the late on a Friday afternoon. So what could possibly go wrong? But hopefully all will be well. And we'll dive straight in and talk a little bit about what we've been doing. And I thought I'd kick off this time round just to make a bit of a change. Because obviously the last podcast we talked about the fact that I was struggling a little bit with my photography. And so with your respective advices ringing in my ears, I have persevered with taking a camera out. And what I actually did is I took the Fujifilm XS10 out, which Kingsley very kindly sent back to me to use. Lovely camera that it is. And I think I spent 3 or 4 days really struggling still. And then I went out, obviously on the dog walk in the morning, and the weather all of a sudden was beautiful. And it just completely transformed everything and made everything so much better. So I think going through this process of shooting in bad weather as well as good weather has kind of really helped me to sort of really enjoy the time that when the weather's really good. And actually the last couple of days, I don't know what it's been like with you guys, but the mornings when I've been going out sort of 7 a.m. have been stunning. There's been a real sort of blanket of mist around. And on both occasions, I've had the sun coming up through the mist. And actually today was probably the absolute highlight because I was able to shoot across a valley and there was lots of low-lying mist in the valley. And it was all rather beautiful. So I feel like I'm getting somewhere. Obviously, I still need to sort of decide what I'm going to do with the images, but I feel like I'm starting to get somewhere.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing these. Are they going to pop up on Instagram or?
They will, Kingsley. I've even been shooting in a square format as well to try and make them Instagram ready. Although
you arty devil.
But I have to admit, I have got a minor confession to make, which I'm sure will please Will no end. And that is the lens that I've been using on the XS10 has been the 18-135, if you like, super zoom.
Super zoom, yay! Go super zooms.
And I have to admit that, much as I do like a fixed focal length prime, if I didn't have the super zoom on today, for example, I wouldn't have been able to get the shots across the valley with the sort of compression, racked it out to the 135mm, and the pictures are really, I've been really impressed with them. As I have been with the camera as well. So I'm not saying I'm a convert, Will, but maybe a gentle nod towards the super zoom fraternity. Speaking of which, have you gone out and bought yours yet?
I haven't bought one, but I've got one on test, strangely enough. And if you could see my desk right now, there are about 6 cameras on it. Several lenses. I'm testing all these for our next issue, which is a double issue. So, for instance, just a name drop, I've got the Panasonic Lumix S5. I've got the new Fujifilm 50mm f1 AF lens, which is amazing. I've got a Nikon Z6 II. I've got a Canon EOS R6, and I've got the aforementioned Nikon 24-200 Super Zoom. So I haven't bought one, but I've been trying it, and I must say, It's very good. I am very impressed, and the fact it does save me a lot of grief carrying the thing, carrying kit around. I'm tempted. So no, I haven't bought one to answer your question.
The interesting thing that I found about using a super zoom is generally that it is very good. It's obviously very flexible. The one frustration that I found with it was that again, because the mornings have been so lovely, you've had lovely low light, and I spotted on our sort of front lawn these hundreds of little spider webs, sort of, that actually, if you shot them at the 200mm setting and compressed the perspective down a little bit, it was sort of really nice. You got the sun backlighting it, but the problem is that you couldn't. I wanted to really shoot really wide open. I really wanted to be shooting at like f2 or f2.8 to get really nice sort of bokeh. And I suppose it just sort of meant that it didn't quite reproduce the exactly sort of the image that I had in my mind. I suppose that was the only sort of, because obviously that Fujifilm lens, when you stick it out to the 135, the maximum aperture is f5.6. So and the bokeh just isn't as beautiful as it would be, for example, with that 50mm f1 that you've got there. But apart from that, I'm, like I say, not a convert, but I'm quite impressed. Anyway, Kingsley, what have you been doing? Throwing yourself throwing yourself around in landscapes, no doubt.
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty much. I was back in Devon, land of salty sea dogs and creamy women, and it was unfortunately no mist. Didn't see any mist. Didn't get up high enough really for any mist, and most of the leaves had been blown away by storm whatever that was coming in off the Atlantic. And so I had 3 trips out, kind of around sunset and kind of blue hour, which I spent on the headland, which is part of the Southwest Coastal Path, sort of taking pictures of the rocks and the sea and stuff. And that was I say it was airy, and slightly scary in places.
Which headland was this?
It's a few miles west of Plymouth. So I can't. It's near the Avon estuary.
Right. Okay.
And there's some really good kind of like cliffs and things around there, and there's also a famous Art Deco hotel called Burr Island, which I might have mentioned before, but it's that's a pretty good subject, kind of from the cliff tops and sort of all around there. And as it gets to low light, it starts, because it's all lit up, it starts to stand out like this kind of beacon, which is quite kind of a nice focal point. But it sort of reminded me, with the high winds, how difficult it can be kind of doing stuff in those kind of conditions, and some of the things that you can try to offset it, like sort of setting the tripod up as low as possible to try and keep it out of the wind, because even with it set up kind of on one leg extension in its normal manner, it was kind of wobbling around a lot. And also there's some interesting stuff about shutter speeds in that's kind of weather, isn't it? Because sometimes slower shutter speeds can be slightly more effective, because like a little wobble of the camera kind of gets balanced out by the much longer shutter speed. Whereas if you're shooting, partly I was trying to shoot reasonably fast to try and capture the texture in the water and stuff, but those pictures were actually quite often less sharp than the ones that were sort of longer.
So I'm struggling to get my head around that. So slightly longer shutter speeds are counteracted by the camera moving.
Yeah, well, it's because the camera's moving throughout the exposure on the shorter shutter speed, but it's only moving for a small amount of time during the longer shutter speed thing. I mean, obviously, if it's moving throughout the whole longer shutter speed thing, all you're going to get is blur. But it was more like there were just these occasional massive gusts of wind coming in, and if you didn't time it right, one of them was going to wobble the camera during the exposure.
So, but given your previous history of landscape danger, the fact that you were precariously perched on a headland in high wind, I mean, the fact that you're talking to us now suggests that obviously you came back totally unscathed, or were you scathed in some way?
I was only scathed by salt water, right, which would have been dangerous for a witch, but thankfully I'm not yet a qualified witch. But the I had a kind of got a bit too close to a wave at one point, because I was down by the water's edge at one point, and that kind of, like, that's fine nothing got damaged. And really, when stuff like that happens, if you're using kind of reasonably weather sealed cameras and equipment and stuff, it's kind of like, well, you can like wipe the filter off, probably have to use a different one because you're not going to be able to clean it properly at the beach side. And then when you get home, just make sure you give everything a good wipe down to make sure there's no sea salt spray and stuff that's kind of collected anywhere sort of too vital. I did at one stage hop over a fence on this headland to try and get closer to a sort of a better angle, a fence that was designed to keep idiots away from the edge of the headland. But I suppose maybe even based on previous conversations we've had, I quickly sort of lost my nerve and hopped back again. That's all part of the landscape photographer's game, isn't it? Like if you don't come back sort of knackered and muddy and and kind of covered in seawater, have you been doing it right? I would question.
And were the pictures worth it?
I'll let the public decide.
So how are the public going to see these pictures?
Well, I'll stick them on Instagram again. I haven't done it yet, but
maybe we should probably. So for anybody who wants to know, my Instagram handle is @RogPayne, and Kingsley, yours is
Kingsley.photo.
And Will, yours?
You know what? I can't remember rightly, but I think he might be Will Chung Tog. Shows how often I use and log on to Instagram, isn't it?
So apart from having a desk full of cameras and lenses, Will, have you had a busy couple of weeks since we last chatted?
Yeah, reasonably. I mean, with all this camera testing, that's taken a lot of time. I did manage to get out for a fungi foray with Annie, which was rather fun. We went to Virginia Water in leafy, is it Surrey? And it was absolutely mobbed. I mean, there were so many people in the car park. And even though I only found this when I left the place, but I got a car parking spot and we were there for 3 hours. It cost £12 to park for 3 hours. Unbelievable. But anyway, despite the high costs, this place was absolutely buzzing with people. But we found some fly agarics, did some nice pictures, did some focus stacking. That was rather fun. And photographically, the other thing we did was last Friday was we had a reader event, a pro photo reader event where we had 3 readers. So thank you to Mike, Mark and Amit for coming along. And that's where we had a session with Hannah Cousins, who's a pro photo ambassador, where she basically ran through core lighting techniques for a feature coming up in the next issue of the magazine. And that was rather fun. I mean, I tell you what, though, it was strange meeting people in the flesh other than your family and partner. So when I did the introduction in the beginning, I actually said to them, I'm sorry about this, but I haven't spoken to anybody in real life for so long. I'm not sure how this is going to work. And it did feel odd. It felt really odd. But the day went well. The 3 guys were brilliant. Hannah was very, very good. And the Pro Photo kit, as you all know, that will perform immaculately as well.
Marvelous. So
it was using the B10 principally, which is a small compact battery operated main studio flash, not mains. And that was awesome. Really good unit. I love a set, but haven't managed to stump up the cash for one yet.
And it was nice for Boris to hold the national lockdown announcement until the day after, Will, just so that you could get your Pro Photo Day in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because of Pro Photo Day, it's postponed like many of our events on Photography News. I mean, for instance, we didn't have a Photo 24 this year for obvious reasons. But this Pro Photo Day was scheduled back in April. So to finally get it done now, it was brilliant because we're going to run out 2020 basically. But it all went well. So I took quite a few pictures there, but just mainly background pictures, and actually using this Fujifilm 50mm f1 lens a lot, because just having f1 is just staggering. I mean, I know the lens is bulky and it's a £1,500 lens. I mean, it's not hideously priced, but it's still expensive. And it's quite bulky. But having that freedom to zip up to f1 is just incredible. I mean, like you mentioned about the super zoom, Rog, with going to 5.6 where you had to shoot. But it's f1. Sorry, my record got stuck, but it's an f1. It's just staggering.
And what's also really good is it's full AF, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's the world's first AF lens of that speed, which
is pretty handy at f1.
Well, it's autofocus. It's fast, but it's also darn good.
My experience of using a fast aperture portrait lens was maybe a Canon 50mm f1. years ago. I think they might have done an EF 50mm f1, and I just spent the whole time with it at f1. And it's for someone you don't use any of the other apertures, right?
Yeah, it's brilliant. And that's exactly what I did.
So they should just build a lens that's just got f1 as an aperture and just don't bother with the aperture ring and all the other bits and sell it for maybe 500 quid less.
Yeah, easy. Maybe it's a magnifying glass, isn't it?
Well, moving on from that, Will, given that you've been talking about the shooting the Pro Photo Day, we thought we'd talk a little bit more about portraiture. We are in another national lockdown here in England, which means that between now and the beginning of December, we're going to have to pretty much stay put. Which might seem a little bit odd to talk about portraiture, but obviously, as we've discussed previously on PN Podcasts, we did do a self-portrait challenge. But we thought we'd talk more specifically about portraiture this time round and about photographing your nearest and dearest. Hopefully, most of you live with somebody else or have access to photograph somebody else in this lockdown. So we thought we'd talk a little bit specifically about lighting portraits. Now, Kingsley, why don't you start? Because I think you were sort of alluding to, before we started recording today, you were alluding to the fact that if you were going to shoot a portrait, you actually wouldn't start with lights. You'd kind of just start with available light. Is that right?
I think, yeah, I think sort of in terms of people having their own style and approach, mine is probably based on immediacy and laziness. And
no surprise
and
there.
Occasionally putting flash in or continuous light, can sort of get in the way of that process slightly, I think. Having said that, I do feel it's important to say that I think, portrait lighting is, I think once you start using it, you discover how incredibly powerful it can be in lifting like a portrait that would otherwise be sort of fairly bland. I mean, going back to the available light thing, obviously you're just simply not in control of available light. You have to work with it. You have to find spaces in which you can kind of make the kind of image that you want. But the great thing, as is probably blatantly obvious to everyone about adding your own light, is that you are in full control. So whether it's flash or continuous light, you can do whatever you like. You can make endlessly different styles of portrait, in one room with two lights. Just by kind of mixing up the effects.
So you don't think that's not, apart from laziness, is that sort of propensity to shoot with just available light? Is that because you initially didn't feel that confident shooting with flash?
I think, like a lot of people, before they use flash and sort of proper flash, studio flash or kind of location flash, there is a certain amount of trepidation about it, and you have to get over that, and then you realize it's actually not complicated at all. And even if you're working with trial and error and you're kind of eschewing things like flash meters and stuff, you can still get amazing results. And as I say, you do discover that it's actually sort of pretty easy. I would say my approach in preferring natural light is more about simply that I find it slightly off-putting setting things up. Sometimes you just want to capture something in the moment, and then I think that maybe kind of bleeds through to other aspects of your photography as well. So, and I suppose the better you get at controlling available light, maybe the less likely you are to use flash. But the other thing I'd say about it is that there are times when I might be I did a woodland portrait shoot recently, and I was using natural light there, but I had to be even more careful because there was so much reflected light in woodland. And that's one of the things that location flash can be really great for, like a little light like the B10 Pro Photo that Will was discussing. Just a little blip of light from that, calibrated to the white balance of the camera, gives you, like perfect skin tones in an environment where otherwise you'd be getting kind of casts and stuff.
But when you're shooting out, like in that particular situation where you're shooting outdoors, I presume that the starting point is very much start with the available light and then add to it. Don't kind of just go into that location, drop the flash gun on the camera, and away you go.
Yeah, I would prefer to use the flash to kind of help with what was there, rather than kind of overpower what was there. I mean, you know, for certain things that would fit into my general kind of outlook with photography. But there's nothing wrong with, you know, the approach of, you know, taking a flash gun out and overpowering the sun and creating like a picture that you can't see with the naked eye. You know, it's perfectly valid in itself, and it's another example of how versatile adding your own light can be.
Turning to you, Will, in terms of your hot from the Pro Photo Reader Day, presumably you're laden with lighting advice for indoor portraiture.
Well, I mean, this time of year it's definitely a challenge, and I mean, Kingsley's talked about available light, and of course I've got this 50mm f1 lens on my desk, and that's perfect for shooting like that. But I like the idea of taking a bit of control and adding a bit of light, you know, be that with an off-camera speed light, with a modifier. For instance, I've got one of these things, which is a Harnell Creative Lantern Kit, and it looks like, I don't know if you've seen one of these before, chaps, but it looks like a lampshade you can put on the front of your strobe on your speed. I mean, there's so many modifiers you've got available nowadays to modify what you put on your speed light. So that's one quick way of working. And of course, I know the Pro Photo B10 is very light and compact, but it's not the sort of thing you just walk about a woodland that just happen to have in the bag and whip out and use. Whereas a speed light, you do stand a chance of having in your camera bag on the odd occasion where you might need it. And I like the idea of not just doing it going for the natural approach, Roger, you mentioned, but I like the corporate style, you know, where they darken the sky and they light up the foreground so the subject looks almost 3D and, you know, almost photoshopped into the dark sky. If you've got the appropriate conditions, of course, but that sort of approach works well for me too.
So, I mean, I think that's quite a popular style, you know, that kind of underexposure of the background and then illuminating the foreground to sort of create that sort of light dark thing. But I think that can be quite difficult to recreate. So how do you sort of go about setting that up? Is it basically ambient exposure first and then underexpose that? How do you do that?
Well, you're right. Obviously, it depends how you want to work and the kit you have available to you, because there are any which ways of skinning a cat. But yeah, you use your shutter speed for the ambient light. So if it's very bright, that can be difficult because you might run out of shutter speed. And then you set the aperture for the flash, and of course that's limiting because if you're a subject with a modest speed light, you haven't got the power to shoot, for instance, at f11 if that's what you want to do. It's a bit of experimentation. It really depends on your kit. But the beauty of it is, you know, going back to the days of film, you just had to bracket like mad, and it would cost you a lot of money because you wasn't sure what you're going to get. This is digital. You know, take a shot and go, oh, the sky's too bright. I'll go down one shutter speed, or I'm not enough flash. I'll open up the aperture, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's completely right. The experimentation of digital makes this stuff really easy to experiment with, and you can get a lot of joy out of it and a lot of like realization about how, you know, how those different parameters come together to make the image. One thing I'd say about those kind of pictures where you've got that hyper real look, where you've got a lit subject and sort of a darker background, is what I kind of tend to notice is that people start off doing it very contrasty, where you have a very underexposed ambient light with the flash. And what you notice about when I think it's used a bit more successfully is when it's used a bit more subtly. So you might only underexpose the ambient light by a stop or even less than that. And that just gives you a little bit of pop rather than something that looks maybe a little bit artificial or too artificial. But then again, it's down to kind of personal taste.
Yes.
Do you also think that a lot of PN readers, listeners may have a bit of fear of flash in terms of, because actually what I've discovered more recently photographing with on-camera flash, be it on camera or slightly, you know, off to one side, is that the TTL systems on these flashes are really good now in terms of, and whether it's a combination of flash and camera, but it just seems to be that it's almost impossible to to take a badly exposed image. You know, it's more about, you know, I mean, you've got the opportunity to experiment with the location of the light and what you've got on it to modify it, but it seems like ridiculously easy to get really good pictures.
You're right though, Roger. And if you go back a few years, and I've met many readers over the years, we talked about flash, and if you started in the film days, started talking to a reader about flash, you could see literally their face hardening up and their eyes glazing over as she's talking about sync speed and aperture and power output and guide numbers. But nowadays, I don't think anymore, because you can just go pop if it comes out. And that's why so few people use flash meters. I mean, when we used to shoot film, you would meter something to hell and back to make sure you got it perfectly even or the ratio right. But now you just go click. And with TTL systems, you're absolutely right. Some of the systems are so good now.
And it also does remind me that you don't necessarily need multiple flash units to get like good quality results. And it reminds me of years ago, back in the day when I used to work on a magazine other than a photography magazine, and went along to a photo shoot with I can't remember his name, but he was a fairly big name photographer, who he went along to photograph a series of models in a garage location. So a series of cars in a garage with models. And he kind of turned up and he got one light out on a stand with an umbrella. And I was kind of like, okay, so where's the rest of your kit? And that was it. And that's all he used. And he just walked around this garage and got really nice sort of mixtures of ambient and with a blip of flash in. And it was like these were magazine quality images he was producing with one basic studio light fired into a brolly and using and mixing it with ambient light. And I was genuinely blown away by how simple it can be.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was watching a YouTube video the other day with Joe McAnally, the American photographer, who's very well known, of course. And he was photographing a street scene. And I think he used 35 speed lights.
And was he selling them for someone, or
lit up and the windows were lit up and everything? It was awesome. But of course, he's got a team of people running around to help him. But yeah, I'm quite impressed with that.
That's just showing off. What, he had them all triggered off on one channel?
Oh, I don't know, Roger. You got very technical in the end. My eyes literally started to glaze over, despite what I just said about flash. It's only because of it was scary numbers. It was just amazing to organise that. It's like being an orchestra conductor.
I mean, you touched on it a little bit earlier, Will, about modifiers and your what looks like some sort of Christmas decoration that you can fit on the front of that flash gun that you were waving in front of your camera there. But modifiers are obviously quite an important element of all this. You don't really want to just turn up and start using a bare sort of flash head. So I mean, starting from sort of bouncing the flash, which you can obviously do inside off walls and stuff like that, but presumably you guys are advocates of things like softboxes, brollies.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I'm a big fan of the shoot through white brolly nowadays. I mean, going back a while, I would never use a white brolly, but now it's just so convenient as a diffuser, and it just packs down in a very compact form, and you can use it in Banks mode as well as in shoot through mode. And you get a lovely effect. And I'd be happy just using one of those nowadays. And of course, there are plenty of soft boxes which fold down, things like the Rogue collection, for instance. They fold flat. You can have them in your camera bag the whole time. And when you do need them, you just whip one out and off you go with your speed light. Really good.
I think that's also a bit like the kind of the fact that you can experiment with literally just flash exposures with digital, and it makes it easier to understand what's going on and how to set things up. It's exactly the same deal with modifiers. If you don't understand how something looks, just put a modifier on, take a picture, and then you will understand it. Move the flash around the subject, see how the modeling of the light kind of changes, and that's where you start to. It's only kind of by doing those things that you actually start to understand the usefulness of different modifiers, like using honeycombs to channel hair light, or big soft boxes to create soft fill light, or anything like that.
So before we move on, I've got one final question for the pair of you. I'll go to you each in turn, starting with you, Kingsley. So your go-to setup. So if you were going to do a portrait of somebody during lockdown, what would your go-to kind of lighting setup be? How many lights? What modifiers would you have, and reflectors or anything like that?
One of the lighting setups that I use more than any other is sort of a simple cross. Is it cross lighting? I don't know if you call it cross lighting, but basically it's just like a big soft box in front and a kind of a hair light behind, and then you get that kind of subject separation with a nice kind of a soft key light on the subject.
And when you say a big softbox, are we talking a studio light here rather than a speed light?
Well, if possible, something a few feet across, yeah, because the larger the softbox, the softer the effect. In comparison to the subject, the larger the light source, the emitter, the softer the lighting will be, which is why, like a bare flash, very small emitter, and that's why you get kind of harder looking light. And as you spread it out, you get that kind of softer effect. So yeah, like big softboxes. The only trouble with big softboxes is they take a lot of power to fill them, so then you need more powerful flash guns.
And the hair light behind that is pointed back at the head, or is that sort of on the background to create a sort of halo effect?
Oh well, no, yeah. To pointed sort of back at the subject, trying not to make it flare into the camera too much, unless that's what you're after. I've always loved those shots where you've got someone with a little pool of light behind them, but I've always found them quite difficult to achieve because people sort of move around, and then you've got to stop and move the flash a little bit, and kind of like. If you're trying to work in a kind of relaxed way, or if you're sort of shooting dogs like I usually do, you can't really say, can you just move 2 centimeters to the right because I want that perfect little halo of light behind you. So yeah, that's a really nice look. But again, I suppose it's another gun, more expense, more setting up. But yeah, it's a great look.
What about you, Will? What's your go-to setup?
Well, obviously, depends on the subject and the situation I'm in. But if I was just doing a nice portrait at home, I would probably go for a beauty setup, which would basically be a butterfly lighting setup, which would be a light with a softbox directly in line with the sitter. So I'm basically shooting around the lighting stand with a softbox above, a reflector below to fill in any shadows, and then I would go for a backlight as well, as Kingsley's done. And I would have it pointed towards the background, angled down to give that nice graduated pool of light, which you also mentioned. So that would be my standby if I was doing a flattering portrait at home.
I don't think you should get away without answering this question, Rod. What would you use? Come on.
I'd use natural light.
And an f1 lens.
No, I think I'd actually go even more simple. I mean, you guys are definitely trying to create a degree of contrast in your lighting setups, whereas I think I would just keep it really quite simple. And actually, I think the most effective stuff is actually where you can recreate a daylight look. So I would probably go, and I have done, is actually just use a hot shoe flash gun and bounce it, and literally sort of point it to a wall or a ceiling. Obviously, you need to. I always control, perhaps unsurprisingly, bearing in mind I like to use primes. I always control my flash output manually, largely because for that very reason that you can control it exactly rather than leaving TTL. You can move slightly from one side to the other, and it can vary the exposure. I prefer to shoot manually with my flash, but yeah, I'll just bounce it off a ceiling. Obviously, as I say, you have to increase your power because you're making the light travel further. But you can get some really nice sort of daylight lit effects. And one of the subjects that I'm been looking to photograph more regularly is my little granddaughter who's just coming around to her first birthday. And obviously, you don't want to in kind of what you're saying, Kingsley. You don't want to be setting something up and then she toddles off somewhere else. Whereas if you're following her around with a flash gun on the camera and bouncing it off various things, you can get sort of nice sort of soft light without having to make her sit in one place. Well, so Will, moving on to the mag then. So the Pro Photo Day is going to be appearing in the next issue?
That's right. There's a 4-page feature about what happened on the day and some feedback from the 3 readers about the event itself. The next issue is also the launch of our awards, where we as an editorial team, and you probably don't remember this, guys, but we got together and nominated our favourite products of the year, from best camera to best lens to best colour management solution. And we're going to ask readers to vote. So that's all going to be done online. So we announced our awards in the next forthcoming issue. Lots of product reviews. I've already mentioned 2 of them, the Canon EOS R6 and the Panasonic Lumix S5, and a few other things like that. So it's going to be an action-packed double issue. We're very busy, as you know, getting everything together for it right now, and hopefully all the bits will fall into place in due course.
Indeed, hence why we're recording this late on a Friday afternoon. Will's had such a busy week. Absolutely. And the issue is out when, Will?
Tail end of November, from the 24th of November.
And of course, you are able to see every issue that we've ever done on the website, photographynews.co.uk. And it wouldn't be right to talk about digital without talking about our various social media channels as well. We're on Twitter, Facebook.
Freudian slip, isn't it?
Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and the handle for all those three is @PhotoNewsPN. Moving on, we shall answer some reader questions, and we've got a couple of blinders here this week. So let's start with the first one, which has come from Natalie P, who's in Bury, and she said, "I'm loving the podcast. It sounds like you've all interviewed some famous photographers in your time, but who did you each find the most inspirational and why?" Kingsley, let's come to you first. Do you want to get some name dropping in there as to famous photographers you've interviewed?
I'm not going to drop a Leibovitz like you did some podcasts ago. I interviewed Terry O'Neill. I mean, I know a lot of people have interviewed Terry O'Neill, but it's kind of a nice, and that was a nice chat. He ended up taking a picture of me, which was quite funny. And quite a nice picture, you know. So no, the one that came to mind though, for me was a guy called Gregory Heisler, who's a famous American portrait photographer, who is, I might have mentioned him on this pod before, but he's famous for shooting, as it was at that point, I think may still be the case, the most front covers of Time magazine in terms of portraits. So, and he's shot, you know, everyone from presidents to film stars and everything in between, actors. And the bit of advice that he talked about when I interviewed him was, it was actually lighting advice. So it fits in quite well with the stuff that we already talked about. And it was something that he used to take from, I don't know whether he worked on film sets, I can't remember, or whether he just shot a lot of people around film sets, but it was a technique called motivating the practical, which is what they do on film sets. And that is about taking the light that should be in a scene and giving it a bit of a kick. So that could be like a candlelit scene. I mean, no one shoots a candlelit scene lit by candles. It's all shot, you know, with lights with warm filters on them, directed in certain ways to make it look like candlelight, or even flickering a bit. You know, they do these days. Rotolight lights do that, don't they? They kind of they've got these kind of flicker settings on them and things like that. But that's what I found really interesting, and what that kind of made me do or take into my own photography was things like, you know, if you're shooting a window lit portrait, there's nothing to stop you putting a light outside that window, as long as it is actually modified in such a way that it doesn't change the way that light would have looked coming through the window. Then you can get, you know, you give yourself more options. And a bit like you were saying about just bouncing flash, that's another kind of a way of doing it. It's like, you know, if you've got a subject near a big wall and that wall is reflecting sunlight and it kind of looks okay, but it's not quite right, then you just throw a load of flash into that wall and you motivate what's there. And that was the best bit of advice.
Well, I obviously will mention Leibovitz, although I didn't actually interview her. I was just along for the ride, and I was taking her photograph.
Just hanging around.
Yeah, hanging around. Yeah, in a groupie style. And actually did a very similar thing with Herb Ritz as well, who was again, I wasn't interviewing him, but I was photographing him, and he was again a really interesting person to listen to. I think of the people who I have actually interviewed, probably the most inspirational person is a lady called Lindsay Addario, who is a photojournalist, war sort of photojournalist, photographer, but also works for National Geographic a lot. And I spent probably about an hour with her, like a couple of years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. And just to listen to her drive and determination to tell stories was amazing, really. And you sort of realize that, you know, I suppose we would probably say that we communicate our messages about photography through what we write, but her sort of her real drive was about getting messages across and telling stories and actually making a difference by the photographs through the photographs she took. And if you haven't heard of her before, I'd urge you to seek her out on the various Instagram, you know, Facebook, etc. channels. But she's also written a fantastic book called It's What I Do, which is a really interesting sort of story about how she got into it, some of the pretty sort of scary, hairy sort of like situations she's been in, including being kidnapped and all this sort of stuff. But she was surprisingly normal after, considering some of the stuff she's seen and some of the stuff she's been through. But I think from an inspirational perspective, I'm going to pull out a name from years ago that I know Will knows, a chap called Les McLean, who I didn't actually interview, but I often quote one of his pieces of advice back to anybody who will listen. And I think you and me, Will, were sat in a pub with Les, not far from the old Practical Photography office, and we were chatting about all sorts of stuff. But one of the things he said was just photograph the light. And it is without doubt a bit of advice that every single time I go out with a camera, that's what I do, is I photograph the light. So although it wasn't an interview, it was more of a chat over a couple of pints. It definitely is the inspirational information advice that I take around with me on a daily basis. Do you remember Les, Will?
I remember him very, very well. He's an awfully nice chap and a very, very good black and white printer. And one of the things I learned from him was when he would shoot a landscape and he had a good session with this landscape, as he left, he would always thank it.
Yeah.
And that's something I still do. I literally did it the other day when I was photographing fly agarics in Virginia water. And as I was walking away, I turned around to Annie. I said, I do this. And she said, what? I said, thank you, fly agarics, for that. And I still do it.
Did you expect them to pay you 12 quid parking fee?
I wish. I darn well wish. Anyway, my photographers, I will name drop because I'm a bit of a tart like that. I mean, in my many years in publishing, I've met some people who are very, very good, well-known photographers. I mean, Avedon, Snowden, Bailey, Donovan, Swinell. I've met all of them and done work with them, but I never used to interview them because I was always on the technical side of the magazine as opposed to the features side. So the features people always had the glory of handling those interviews. But a couple of people I did spend time with. One was Patrick Litchfield, who inspired me with his enthusiasm and his down-to-earthness. I mean, he's the Queen's cousin and everything else. And I mean, you probably remember, Rog, we had dinner at his gaff a while ago.
I do remember.
For a hall, which was stunning. But he was a most approachable guy, very keen to help. And the other chap I would mention, and who inspired me a great deal, even though I never took photographs like of the type he does or did, and that was Bob Carlos Clark. His black and white work just was awesome. And I had a lunch with him because he was a columnist for Practical Photography. So I enjoyed many a lunch with him, and I saw his studio, I saw his dark room, saw the way he worked.
Did you borrow any latex?
I wish I had some. But no, he was a great bloke to work with as a columnist, and also to me a really inspirational photographer, and a very sad loss, I'm afraid.
Indeed. Well, hopefully, Natalie, that answers your question, given us a good opportunity to have a little trip down memory lane as well. Natalie, as indeed the second person, sent their emails to podcast@photographynews.co.uk. So please do use that email address if you'd like to get in touch with us about anything that you hear on the podcast, but also specifically if you've got a question for us. And moving on to that second question comes from somebody called Joshua from Milton Keynes. Hi, Joshua. He says, I'm keen to have a go at shooting film again, but I want to buy a new SLR to shoot with. I'm a Nikon DSLR owner, so it would make sense to go with a Nikon body, but which model would you guys recommend? I have a maximum budget of £200. Will?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky question in a way, Joshua, because there's so many different cameras to choose from. But one of my favourites, going back quite a few years, was the Nikon FA, and that's one of the first cameras that came out with multi-pattern metering. I mean, I think it had 5 patterns it metered from. This was in a day and age where most cameras were center-weighted metering, or maybe had spot metering. And the odd camera had partial metering if you could afford it. But this had the 5-pattern multi-pattern metering sensor, and it worked really well. And it was a nice, solid camera, and I always aspired to one. So if I was looking back now, thinking, "Oh, I want to shoot film," and if I could afford it, I don't know how much FAs go for. I need to check that, but that's one I would suggest you look at, Joshua.
You could definitely pick one of those up for a couple of £100 or maybe a little bit less. And you can also with my recommendation, which is the FM, which I did a little bit of research on this, and actually the FM was around in various guises for 29 years. And FM, I don't know whether I presume it didn't actually stand for fully manual or fully mechanical, but that's exactly what it was. In that it is full manual exposure. It only requires batteries to run the light meter. You can actually use it without batteries whatsoever. 1,000 to 1 second shutter speed plus B. Really simple, really rugged. And actually, I did a little bit of scooch around on eBay earlier, and I've actually found one there that's it's 60 quid body only or best offer. So I've that one's probably going to have gone, Joshua, by the time you get around, because I'm quite tempted to put an offer in it for myself. Now, obviously, 60 quid gives you about 140, 130 quid or so out of your budget left. And obviously, that's the other thing I was going to say is that going back to film is quite a pricey thing, and you might find that you can quite easily, shoot 2 or 3 rolls of film, and you'll spend the remaining 100 quid on getting them processed. So that at least gives you a few processing hits out of your original budget. So that's my recommendation. What about you, Kingsley?
I'm gonna put the brakes on Joshua's foray. Not into film. I just think it's worth. I don't know why if you've already got a DSLR, full frame DSLR, I don't know why you'd go back and want to shoot on a film SLR. I don't know how that would. I suppose there's the novelty factor of going back to that, but you've got the same view, haven't you? Like if I was going to do that, I'd go and try a completely different format of camera. I'd go and try and find like a medium format camera and shoot film on that. I mean, I just looked on eBay as we were kind of warming up, and there's a Yashica D vintage circa 1960. It describes it as TLR medium format film camera, 210 quid with a lens on it. I mean, I don't know.
That's over his budget. Have you listened to the question? That's over his.
Well, do you know what, Rog? It says best offer accepted, so he might be able to get it for under the magic number. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'd maybe look to be a bit more expensive.
Well, maybe. I mean, Joshua doesn't go into this level of detail, but maybe it's the fact that he's got a whole load of lenses. So he presumably wants to be able to realise his lens range on the film SLR. But no, I'm quite an advocate of trying something different. Years ago, I used to have a C330 Mamiya twin lens reflex thing, which was great. Although I did check those are like 300 or 400 quid these days, so they're not cheap. But yeah, I'm all for trying different formats and different things. It might be an extra thing to try.
I'd imagine. Who can we think of that might have a loft full of weird and wonderful film cat? Will Chung.
I used to have a Mamiya C330F, but I got rid of that a while ago, I'm afraid. No, my medium format went out a while ago.
You've not got an old Lubitel or anything like that up there, Will?
No, I've got a Holger, and that's something I would maybe suggest everybody to try. This if you want to try this film palaver, which I'm still a keen advocate of. So I don't know why Kingsley's going, oh, why shoot film? But I'll buy something like a Holger and go for those blurry edges and things.
I'm not saying don't shoot film. I'm saying
you clearly are.
I'm saying don't buy a film SLR if you've got a similar 35mm digital SLR. But hey,
it's the experience of shooting film, Kingsley.
Yeah, and you don't.
It's rubbish. You'll find out it's rubbish.
And if he bought a medium format camera, he'd only have 12 pictures. So
and
especially
it would be more expensive to process.
Absolutely. So ignore what Kingsley said and instead buy an FM or an FA. And I'll probably have one in my possession by the time this podcast comes out. So drop me a line, Joshua, and we'll do a deal. We'll do a deal. Excellent. Okay. Well, like I say, those questions were sent through to podcast@photographynews.co.uk. So please do get in touch if you've got anything that you would like us to answer or, in fact, argue about. So as we come to the end of this episode 13, we seem to have gone fairly well so far. But we wouldn't end a podcast without asking for a Will's word of wisdom. So, Will, on this late Friday evening, before you go to the fridge and get a couple of tinnies out, what is your Will's word of wisdom?
Well, strange enough, I'm on the wagon. But anyway, something else. I was racking my brains about this earlier.
Hang on a minute. You're on the wagon.
Yeah. Whoa there.
This is news.
Well, Well, look, you guys know I can't drink, so I've actually thought, well, sod it, I'm going to stop drinking for a bit.
Right, just in prep for Christmas. Right?
Yeah. But no, I was thinking about the bit of advice I was going to give. I was interviewing somebody earlier on Zoom, and he was doing some night pictures, and that got me thinking about, look, you know, we're all probably going to go and do some night pictures this coming few months, be it outside doing light trails or maybe some stars. And my tip would be, if you haven't got one, buy yourself a head torch. And better yet, if you can, get one of those head torches which gives out a red light. Because then when you're out trying to fiddle with your camera, you can use a red light, see what you're doing, etc., etc. But it doesn't burn out your night vision. So your night vision, you know, you don't lose it when you turn off this red light. It's very different from using a white light, which of course is much stronger. And then when you go back to the darkness after you fiddle with your camera, you can't see a thing, and it takes you ages to settle down again. So I was just thinking, difficult, I know, with lockdown, so you probably have to buy it from an online retailer, but get yourself a head torch with a red light setting.
Well,
excellent.
Nice one, Will. Thank you very much for that. And thanks very much to the pair of you for this latest episode of the Photography News podcast, which just leaves us to say, before we race to the fridge to get drinks, thank you very much to tartan-wearing contributing editor Kingsley Singleton. Thanks, Kingsley.
Thank you very much, as always. I've been most inspired this time by Will's mention of thanking the landscape and by the head torch. My other tip was that on coming back from my trip to the headland, the coast, I found a place to buy some chips. So that completed my landscape shoot perfectly, eating chips on the way back up the hill.
Well, thanks also to you, editor, Mr. Photography, Will Chung. Thanks, Will.
No problem, guys. And I was thinking you should definitely thank the landscape when you leave the place, because if you haven't fallen over or fallen in or broken a lens or a filter, you should definitely thank the landscape.
Yeah, you should get down on your knee pads.
I've not got those yet.
Anyway, chaps, a pleasure as always. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.
We will indeed. Thanks very much, chaps. Cheers.